A black woman threatened River Oaks? Do you even know Karen's husband is the mayor here? Officer Wilson barked. Angelica was just jogging, but instead of asking her name, they slapped her, insulted her, and cuffed her like a criminal. No one spoke. No one stepped in, because they didn't know she was Commander Angelica Washington, a senior military police officer in the U.S. Army. In your state, if you don't look wealthy enough, are you automatically a threat? River Oaks, 6:12 a.m. A light breeze drifted through rows of manicured trees lining the stone-paved path. The morning sun filtered through gleaming glass windows, landing softly on lawns trimmed as precisely as a retouched face. The only sounds here were the clicks of high heels from a homeowner retrieving the newspaper, and the hiss of espresso machines in million-dollar kitchens. Angelica Washington brought nothing with her but herself. No earbuds, no water bottle, no protective gear, just a pair of worn running shoes, still stained with a bit of Middle Eastern red dust, and a steady, straight stride, never skipping Baybat. She was the only black person on this stretch, and she knew it, not because someone said so, but because no one said anything. She passed a few houses draped in American flags. One even displayed a "Support Our Troops" sign right beneath a golf club logo. Angelica glanced at it, but didn't stop. There was something bitterly ironic about how those patriotic slogans didn't seem to include people of her skin tone, unless they were dead. A soft screech broke the calm. A sleek white SUV swerved into the path, blocking her way. Karen Monroe, soft blonde curls, makeup applied just enough to look natural, stood holding a pink smoothie. Lululemon pullover, Fitbit watch, spotless white sneakers. She looked like a lifestyle ad, affluent, pristine, and white. Karen didn't smile. She stood in Angelica's path. "Excuse me," she said in a measured tone like asking the time, "but what exactly are you doing in this neighborhood?" Angelica stopped one step away, unflinching, unsurprised. "Running?" she replied, her voice as even as a weather report. Karen squinted. "Oh, but we don't usually have service staff wandering around in the mornings." The words landed on the stone path like a pebble, small, but enough to disrupt someone's breath. Angelica tilted her head slightly. Her glance, cold as a scalpel, carried no threat, no anger, just the stillness of someone who doesn't need to explain. "I don't serve anyone," she said, eyes never leaving Karen. "But clearly you're still serving your own backwardness." Karen stepped back half a pace, not out of fear but confusion. She couldn't tell how she'd just been insulted. "What did you just say?" Her voice rose, seeking an audience. Angelica didn't answer. She turned and resumed her run. Her pace was steady, no rush, there was no need. And in that moment, amidst a home's worth millions, a black woman passed through prejudice without faltering, and that, perhaps, disturbed Karen more than any words could. "You think you can just walk in here like you belong?" Karen called out, voice now shrill and stripped of poise. Angelica stopped, didn't turn. After 3 seconds of silence, she slowly pivoted. Karen stood alone on the sidewalk, one hand on her hip, the other clutching her now half-melted smoothie. Her lightly made-up face flushed, not with embarrassment, but with the sting of losing control. "I'm the HOA president here. You need to prove you live in this neighborhood." Angelica didn't respond immediately. She tilted her head, as if checking whether Karen truly believed what she'd just said. A soft breeze carried a yellow leaf past her face, and just then, the sun emerged from behind a rooftop, tracing slivers of light along her cheekbones like twin blades. Then she spoke, not loud, not harsh, not cruel, but every word metallic and cool. "Instead of obsessing over your figure and status, maybe try living with a fresher soul, a gentler manner, and a sharper mind. Grown adults don't act out of petty jealousy or judge others by skin color, unless you're still living in the 19th or 20th century. Angelica didn't repeat herself. She turned and resumed her run. Her pace was steady as ever. No hurry. She didn't need it. And in that moment, in a neighborhood framed by luxury and suspicion, a black woman passed through judgment without shrinking, and that, more than anything, unsettled Karen. The air froze. Karen's face flushed deeper. Her grip tightened on her latte until the lid popped off, splashing coffee onto her sweatshirt. "You think you can talk to me like that? Are you threatening me?" she barked, stepping back and pulling out her phone. Karen paused, breath held, then spoke again, this time louder, voice shaking but calculated, trying to shape a narrative. She's threatening me. I'm calling the police. You'll regret this. A suspicious black woman is threatening me in this neighborhood. She seems unstable. Yes, I'm being threatened." The sound of a police siren sliced through the morning air like a blade. River Oaks, where only lawn mowers and automatic garage doors were usually heard, now echoed with a noise that didn't belong and that no one wanted to hear. A white-gray patrol car screeched to a stop at the curb, its wheels veering slightly off the painted line, leaving a faint skid mark on the unnaturally pristine pavement. Two white officers stepped out, young, confident, still believing in authority as a weapon backed by legal sanction. Wilson, tall, with a buzz cut, didn't need to judge, his eyes already condemned. Thompson, shorter, his face flushed, whether from the heat or readiness to act. No one asked Angelica for her name, ID, or version of the story. No one checked Karen's statement, the woman standing front and center like she owned the stage. Karen walked forward, unafraid and clearly pleased. "She's the one. She threatened me." No further details. No timestamp, no proof. Wilson nodded as if the arrest had been ordered by the Senate itself. Thompson stepped toward Angelica, hand hovering near his belt, not for protection but preparation. "You're causing a disturbance in a private neighborhood. Hands behind your back." Angelica frowned. Her voice didn't rise but didn't soften either. Her question wasn't provocation, it was what any reasonable person would ask in an unreasonable moment. "What am I being charged with?" Wilson stepped forward and shouted. "A black woman threatening the elite neighborhood of River Oaks? Do you even know Karen's husband is the mayor?" Without waiting for an answer, he shoved her shoulder hard. She stumbled slightly, still regaining her balance when Thompson struck the back of her neck, a dry, brutal slap that rang out like a silenced truth. Angelica staggered. Her eyes widened, not from pain, but recognition, the kind familiar to someone who had faced gun barrels without flinching, yet never got used to the way the system slapped dignity out of bodies like hers. She didn't retaliate, didn't scream. Her hands stayed down, loose at her sides, as if holding back something heavier than pain. Wilson twisted her arms back, cold cuffs clicking shut over sweat-drenched wrists. Thompson pushed her head down onto the scorching hot hood. All of it took less than 2 minutes. Karen crossed her arms and stepped back, adjusting her stance for a better view. A slight smile played on her lips, the kind only found on those who believe they were born into the right place in society and are merely enforcing the order. No one questioned anything. In a place like this, a white woman's word was enough. A black woman's presence, even unarmed, composed and innocent, was still a political threat to the illusion of peace. Angelica didn't need to scream. She already knew. If no one saw what just happened, the story would be rewritten. She resisted, disobeyed, maybe even had a weapon. She stayed silent, but her eyes did not close. Dr. Marcus Chen never liked interfering in neighborly affairs. As a neurologist, he understood better than most that people become defensive when their sense of security is threatened, especially in communities where security is guarded by HOA bylaws and white stone pillars. That morning, he had just finished brushing his teeth. A damp towel still in hand, he heard the screeching tires, the yelling, and the pounding of boots on paved brick. He stepped onto the second-floor balcony, still in his robe. Through the magnolia trees, he saw a black woman being handcuffed, her head forced down onto a car hood. A blonde woman in high-end workout clothes stood with her arms crossed, her face showing no fear. Marcus didn't know their names, but he recognized the roles. He didn't shout, didn't call out, didn't phone anyone. He just picked up his phone, opened the camera, and recorded. No zoom, no shaking hands, no commentary, just footage. Angelica didn't know someone was watching. She didn't cry out. Blood trickled from her lip onto her clothes. Her arms were pulled behind her. and one sentence rang out clearly from Officer Wilson. "We trust the HOA. You don't belong here." That sentence made Marcus pause, not from anger, but from the calm with which it was spoken, like it was a self-evident truth, beyond question or explanation. Angelica lifted her head. Her eyes didn't look straight at Marcus, but they hit the lens. A gaze with no rage, no fear, no plea for mercy, just a knowing look. Someone is watching. Marcus instinctively held his phone steady, no trembling, even though his heart was racing, and sweat started to bead at his collar. He had seen police handle people of color before, but never a woman so calm, so blameless, so still, yet treated as a criminal. And never before had he seen a gaze like that. The video lasted 2 minutes and 38 seconds. No cuts, no effects, no music. Just the sound of heavy breathing, handcuffs clinking, and shoes dragging across concrete, as if dignity itself was being dragged away, never to return. Marcus didn't know what he'd do with the video. He just knew it had to exist. Without it, the story would have been told through police reports, HOA statements, and the voices of those who were never slapped. And as Angelica was shoved into the back seat of the cruiser, Marcus stopped recording. But he didn't power off. He saved the clip under a simple name: River_Oaks_morning. Later, the video would spread across social media, appear on national news, and be replayed in congressional hearings. But in that moment, it was just one quiet recording, by quiet man, inside a system that wouldn't stop shouting. Houston, 4:02 p.m. The afternoon sun filtered through the large glass dome, casting pale light across the marble floor like a thin layer of dust left by a long day's work. The main lobby of the Houston Police Department wasn't crowded, but it held just enough people to make one thing clear: this place runs on routine and power. A sharp sound echoed as the glass doors slid open. Heads turned out of reflex, then paused, because the person walking in wasn't like the others. Angelica Washington was no longer the woman in gym clothes, soaked in sweat, who had been shoved onto a car hood earlier that morning. She now wore the official olive-green uniform of the United States Military Police. Silver double stars adorned her shoulders. Her nameplate read sharp and unmistakable: Commander Washington. Her chest bore rows of medals, combat tours, joint strategy commendations, and honors for international coordination. Her posture was rigid, her collar buttoned, her gaze steady and unapologetic. No one spoke. A blonde-haired receptionist in uniform half rose from her chair, lips parting to ask, "May I help?" But her voice faltered when her eyes caught the stars. She swallowed the question and a heartbeat. Angelica didn't stop. She didn't rush either. She walked at a steady pace. Each step sounded like a clock striking. "I'm not here to explain. I'm here to exist." She brought no lawyer, no media, no entourage, yet the entire lobby seemed to compress as she passed. Eyes tightened, not out of fear, but uncertainty. How does one face someone who no longer fits the script? The door to the Civilian Complaint Division eased open. A Latino officer exited with a file in hand and nearly collided with her. "Sorry, ma'am, Commander," he stammered, catching her nameplate. Angelica didn't reply. Just a slight nod, just enough to keep it polite and make it clear introductions were unnecessary. Down the right hallway, in a staff meeting room, Officers Wilson and Thompson remained unaware. The woman they had struck earlier had returned, not with words, but with something they couldn't refute: rank and truth. The younger officer, halfway through a text, froze when she passed. He squinted at her nameplate and lowered his phone. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. The pressure shift, like a quiet storm slowly enveloping the building. Angelica turned left. The complaint office door was already ajar. She entered without knocking. Subtle twist. Not a single person in the lobby had been present that morning, yet their eyes, hesitant, restless, expectant, said everything. They knew they were about to witness something beyond protocol. A complaint could be processed through paperwork. But when a decorated military commander walks into a precinct with battlefield honors pinned to her chest, no one's prepared for that. And certainly no one imagined that a slap from the morning would shake an entire system by nightfall. At exactly 4:19 p.m., as Angelica entered the civilian complaint division across the city, Dr. Marcus Chen hit post. No hashtags, no geotags, no edits, just one line, cold as conscience knocking on the door. Not the first time, but this time, I won't stay silent. The video opened with a simple frame. A black woman, handcuffed, shoved face down on a car hood by two white officers. No screaming, no gore. Just sunlight, sweat, and a gaze. A gaze that looked straight ahead. Not angry, not begging, just quietly asking, "What will you do with yourselves after seeing this?" Within 15 minutes, the clip surged online, first shared by Asian American communities, people who had long felt the nameless fear of simply existing in the wrong place. Then came the veteran groups. One member commented beneath the video, "Her shoulder stars don't need your permission to be respected." Twitter ignited. A local news outlet reposted with the headline, "She didn't scream, she didn't strike back, but that gaze made the whole nation freeze." Meanwhile, Angelica waited, not in a private office, not in the commander's lounge. She chose a single plastic chair in the public waiting area. No abuse of power, no desk pounding, no "do you know who I am?" She just sat, hands resting on her lap, back straight, eyes forward, as if listening to something distant, a ripple in the air, the sound of truth finally speaking, louder than any punch. Phones rang more than usual across the precinct. Some lines were silenced altogether. The media desk fielded over 30 calls in 1 hour, reporters asking, "Is she really an officer? Why didn't anyone stop it?" But Angelica didn't check her phone. She hadn't brought a laptop. She simply sat there, an immovable presence, like a stone pressed down by years of buried truths, now cracking open. Bit by bit, a young officer passed by. He almost kept walking, but then his eyes caught her nameplate, Commander Washington. He froze for a second, didn't salute, didn't walk on as if nothing had happened. No one had trained him for this moment, when the wrongfully detained outranks the entire chain of command that cuffed her. The room wasn't large, not too bright, but the air thickened, like the moment before a storm, when everyone senses the shift, but no one yet knows its magnitude. Angelica remained still, not because she had nothing to say, but because what needed to be known, the whole country already knew. Her silence wasn't passive, it was weight, like a mountain of truth, compressed for years, now pressing outward, cracking through a system that mistook silence for submission. And somewhere in that very building, Officers Wilson and Thompson still had no idea that they hadn't just struck a woman. They had struck the heart of honor itself. Angelica left the Houston Police Department just before 6 in the evening. The sun was still out, but no longer harsh. The twilight glow spilled across the white stone steps like a fleeting comfort for those leaving a place where the word sorry held no meaning. She didn't go home. She didn't return to base. Instead, she turned into a quiet cafe in Midtown, where a woman was already seated, one hand resting on a thick stack of reddish-brown folders. Zoe Franklin, petite build, tightly coiled hair pulled high, eyes sharp like someone used to confronting both bias and legal ambiguity. She didn't stand for a handshake, didn't smile in greeting. She went straight to the point. "Do you want to take down the system or just scare two cops?" Angelica didn't blink. She pulled out a chair, sat down, her back straight, her voice steady. "Both, but we start at the root." Zoe nodded. That was the answer she needed. For the next 2 hours, they pored over public records from the River Oaks HOA, the Homeowners Association, where Karen Monroe was serving her 3rd term as president. On the surface, the HOA operated by the book. Meeting minutes were public, violation notices clearly printed and posted. But once Zoe began cross-referencing citations by name, a strange pattern emerged. Nearly every black resident who had moved in over the past 5 years had received at least 3 complaints within their first 90 days, planting unauthorized trees, misdirecting security cameras, leaving garbage bins out past pickup time and causing noise during designated rest hours. Yet almost none of the complaints came with photos. There were no signed statements from neighbors, and there wasn't a single case of white residents being cited with similar frequency. "They're not driving people out with guns, they're doing it with paperwork," Zoe muttered. Angelica stayed quiet, her gaze fixed on the repeated name, Karen Monroe, chair of the Community Ethics Committee, in nearly every report. Then Zoe opened an older file and pointed to a faded note. "Temporary Committee on Demographic Adjustment, West Briar, 5 years ago. Chair, Karen Monroe." The phrase sounded bureaucratic, but Angelica had spent long enough in the military to know when people use extra words to describe something, it usually isn't clean. "Demographic adjustment?" she asked. Zoe nodded. It was code for forced removal of black residents from gentrifying neighborhoods. They used landscaping ordinances, community rules, and legal pressure. Karen authored most of it. Angelica wasn't surprised, but the chill in her eyes deepened. So this morning wasn't just an incident, it was the product of a tested framework. Zoe nodded again. "Exactly. And if you want to bring down the system, start with the HOA. Not the police department." Angelica nodded. Night had fallen by then, but this time, darkness wasn't a cover. It was the stage for truth to emerge. 2 days later, Zoe Franklin entered the Houston County office with her Texas bar card and a formal request to access community governance records. She was denied. The clerk, a middle-aged man with half-rimmed glasses, claimed the records for the West Briar Demographic Adjustment Committee were not fully archived, and that detailed minutes were outside the scope of public disclosure. Zoe didn't flinch. She quietly texted a retired court clerk she had worked with 5 years earlier on a civil case. 40 minutes later, she left the office holding a slim but weighty folder. Internal records never digitized, meeting notes, handwritten memos, and proposals for enforcement that were never made public. Back at the cafe, Zoe placed the file in front of Angelica. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Angelica opened the first page. There was Karen Monroe's name listed under Community Reconciliation Initiative spokesperson. A pretty title. But 3 pages later, that soft language gave way to signatures. Karen's name appeared on a proposal for property seizure. Reason: resident failed to meet landscaping standards as per Article 6, Section C of the Community Covenant. A line underneath noted, 3 notices sent. No satisfactory response. Zoe pointed to the footnote. The resident was disabled. Under federal law, HOA landscaping codes cannot override disability accommodations. Angelica narrowed her eyes and turned to the appendix. Her gaze stopped at the name. Bennett J. Harlow, retired U.S. Marine Corps Major. A chill slid down her spine. "I knew him," Angelica said slowly. "He wrote op-eds against HOA policies under the pen name BH on the Veterans Forum. Every piece ended with, 'By honor, I will not stay silent.'" She circled the name with her pen. Her hand didn't shake, but something inside was clearly restrained. "She doesn't just hate me," Angelica said, like breathing out a truth she had long known but never named. "She hates anyone who ever wore a uniform and doesn't look like her." Zoe nodded, her voice low but steady as a nailed plank. "Karen isn't a racist by impulse. She turns bias into policy, sanctions it through minutes, motions, and administrative language." Angelica closed her eyes for 3 seconds. "And if we don't dismantle the personal dispute image she's hiding behind, everything she does will look like an accident." Zoe closed the file and rested her hand on the cover. "To prove systemic intent, we need a repeated pattern, a hidden motive, and real consequences." Angelica stood up. Her gaze was no longer angry, it was focused. "Start with West Briar. Find everyone who was forced out. I'll take it from there." That night, an anonymous email was sent to more than 20 residents previously penalized by the HOA in the past 5 years. The subject line was simple. "Have you ever been pushed out of the place you called home just because you didn't look like them?" The bar was tucked behind an old gas station on Westheimer Boulevard, its faded sign barely visible, the glass door perpetually clouded by cigarette smoke. There was no music here, no cocktails, just old wooden stools and a silent bar counter, frequented by a few regulars who preferred not to be asked their names. Lieutenant Darrell Boone sat in the farthest corner, wearing a wrinkled gray shirt with no badge, no weapon. His stocky frame and salt-and-pepper hair faded into the dim lighting, and his eyes, like the old walls of the force, had seen too much to still react to questions of right and wrong. Angelica approached, not in uniform, without her usual case files or hardened expression. All she carried was a thick, pale yellow envelope, which she placed gently on the table in front of Boone. He glanced at it, then at her. 10 seconds passed in silence. "I thought I'd stepped away from all this," he said, voice low and gravelly. "But then, you sent me a name I couldn't forget." Angelica nodded and pulled out 2 sheets. One was a copy of the illegal eviction order for Major Bennett J. Harlow. The other, a frame from a video, an image of herself, handcuffed in the street, blood at her mouth, her head pinned to a car hood. Boone studied the image, then folded it and placed it atop his glass of water. "I used to drink with Harlow, rigid to a fault, but never forgot to call someone brother just because their skin was a different color. He once told me, off the battlefield, justice is the final war we can't afford to lose." Angelica remained quiet. Boone leaned his elbows on the table, eyes drifting toward a faint yellow light in the ceiling corner. "I've seen more than I can ever say, and I've stayed silent more than I like to admit." "Why?" she asked, not accusing, just curious. "Because I survived by knowing when to stay quiet. Guys like me, not great, not terrible, not too right or too wrong, they let us be, as long as we don't make the system uncomfortable." Angelica laid her hand on the table and slowly opened the envelope further. Inside was a faded map of West Briar and a list of residents evicted over the last decade, mostly people of color. Some names were marked with stars. Boone scanned it, raising a brow slightly. "They're repeating West Briar and River Oaks," Angelica said firmly. Boone looked back at her, a flicker of regret in his eyes. "You're not the first, Angelica," he said, calling her name for the first time, "but maybe the last one who'll make them pay for it." Outside, light rain began to fall. Boone picked up a napkin, wiped the table and then his hands like a man who had just stepped away from a battlefield he never quite finished. "They call it the Gold Zone, but I've never seen gold stained with this much mud and blood." Angelica didn't respond. This time she picked up the map, not to put it away, but to continue drawing. Boone pulled a tri-folded paper from his coat pocket. It was yellowed, the edges curled, but the pen marks were still clear, a photocopy of an internal deployment map from 2015, the kind most young officers had never seen. He spread it across the table and pointed at scattered red dots throughout Houston. Each dot marked a color shift zone. A small legend showed that these areas once had over 60% minority residents, but now have reduced to under 15%. Property values had risen by 42% on average, some even up to 60%. Boone's gaze didn't leave the map, as though he were walking back through the years he'd once coordinated every block, every patrol. "They called it Operation Gold Zone," he said in an even tone. "Not because there's gold, but because once the land changes color, banks lend easier, insurance drops, investors rush in." Angelica leaned back, arms crossed. "Who's they?" Boone gave a dry laugh. "No names, no memos, but everybody knows. Commanders called it a community upgrade strategy. What it really meant was pick a zone, label it, smear it, push 'em out." He pointed to a section of the map. West Briar, once a black community, now just a few scattered homes surrounded by HOA flags and private property signs. First, they call for more patrols. Then they record disruptive behavior. No evidence necessary, just a few vague reports. Then the file gets sent to the HOA, and the HOA has legal ways to handle things. Angelica's fists tensed slightly. Boone pointed to River Oaks. The red dot there hadn't been circled, but next to it was a dotted pencil ring, a mark only found on internal maps, an unfinished target. "They want one last recoloring, Boone said slowly, and you showed up at the wrong time for them. Angelica looked down at the uncircled dot, the very place where she now lived. All because I jogged in the morning? Boone shook his head. Not because you ran, because they can't control how you exist. Silence. Angelica looked at him again. Why didn't you ever speak up? Boone rested his forehead on one hand. One blink carried the weight of a decade, because those who spoke up aren't in the department anymore, or they've got nothing left to lose. He told her about an internal affairs officer named Ramirez, who once submitted an anonymous report on resident file tampering. 3 months later, reassigned to the archives. 6 months later, he quit. Another, a woman, had once questioned superiors about the target maps, later labeled non-compliant with community directives. I'm not afraid of getting fired, Boone said. I'm just tired of knowing that in this system, wrong doesn't need fixing, it just needs quiet. Angelica folded the map and slid it into her coat pocket, like live evidence. I didn't come to preserve, she said. Eyes locked on his. I came to dismantle. Boone stared at her for a long while. Then he nodded slowly, like a veteran finally passing the map to someone strong enough to finish the march. 10:47 p.m. The only light in Angelica's room came from her laptop screen. She was reviewing the demographic enforcement map Boone had provided when a soft notification ding echoed, small but jarring like an alarm. Sender, m.r.dg45@hpd.net. Subject, I can't stay silent anymore. No greeting, no introduction, just one sentence. Not everyone at the department is colorblind. Some of us were just forced to shut our eyes. Attached was an internal report never submitted to command. Title, Undocumented Classification Records. Resident Behavior Control Priority Zones 201422023. She skimmed quickly. River Oaks, West Briar, East Heights. Each listed frequently flagged residents with vague notes like unclear activities, inappropriate community interaction, and lack of cooperation with authorities. No mention of race. But names Daniels, Harlow, Najjar, Okafor told the story no one wanted to read aloud. A sidebar graph highlighted a developing area, Haven Trail. It was marked pending redistribution with a faint note, price coefficient unstable, demographic integrity must be preserved. Angelica exhaled slowly. She didn't need to know who sent it. She already knew someone inside had decided to stop pretending. Within the hour, she traced the source. The address came from a mid-level HR system, lightly encrypted, enough to fool admin logs. Not her. Miguel Rodriguez, age 34, Internal Affairs Officer, Behavioral Oversight Division. Clean record, no scandals, but one red mark. 2021 post-random compliance checks in multi-ethnic zones. Failed to align with risk management strategy. Summary, lacks strategic coordination mindset. She reread it 3 times, then gave a cold smile. One text, I want to meet. Not for the file, for the trust. 4 minutes later, his reply, 8:00 a.m. tomorrow. Parking deck 3, basement level, no cameras. No explanation, no details. She stared at the message, knowing if Boone had the map, Rodriguez was the first crack in the wall they were hiding behind. She powered down. No screenshots, no notes. Everything would stay in memory. The kind forged in people who've been hurt and no longer believe in paper over truth. Parking deck 3, Houston Police Department. No cameras, no signs, just flickering fluorescent lights over damp concrete. Rodriguez stood waiting. No uniform, no name badge. Just a young man with cautious eyes and a posture somewhere between hesitation and conviction. He saw Angelica the moment she exited the elevator. No handshake, no greetings. One car fit between them. I know they'll scan internal logs, he said, so I'll keep this short. There's one case you need to see. He handed her a thin, folded file, edges worn, no label but a handwritten name. Myra Daniels. One of 37 residents evicted in the past 5 years. But this is the first case with clear procedural fraud. Angelica flipped through it. Each line sterile, bureaucratic. Eviction reason, violation of HOA flag policy, section 14B. Warnings, 3 emails. Decision, Passed in an emergency HOA meeting. No legal counsel present. Section 14B, Rodriguez explained, requires residents to fly a specific flag on national holidays. Passed last June. Emailed, only. Ms. Daniels didn't have a computer. Lives alone. Angelica read the last note. No reply to warnings, interpreted as refusal to cooperate. And then? She asked. Her home was seized. Auctioned after 3 weeks. Buyer, Chelsea Monroe, cousin of the... Angelica looked up. Not shocked. Just that quiet, surgical kind of silence when anger has already been surpassed by cold confirmation. I checked everything, Rodriguez added. They skipped postal notification required by federal law for anyone 65 and older without email. Ms. Daniels is 78. Angelica closed the file, resting her hand on it, as if anchoring someone else's pain. If we prove this is a pattern, she said, Karen isn't just a community issue. She's a criminal. Property collusion. Rodriguez nodded. His eyes were tired but steady. I used to think the system could fix itself. But it doesn't. It legalizes little wrongs until no one sees anything wrong at all. Then he looked her straight in the eye, voice trembling slightly, not with fear, but something deeper, finally moving inside a man who once chose silence. I never believed the system could change itself, but for the first time, I want to try. Angelica didn't reply at once. She studied him, not just the file, but the person. Then she nodded. Then we start with Daniels, but we won't stop there. The file in her hands, though slim, felt suddenly as heavy as an unspoken verdict. Victor Ellis's apartment was on the 9th floor of an old building in Midtown. No doorbell, no nameplate, just a peephole covered with foggy tape. Angelica once joked, "You live like you're on an undercover mission, even though the war ended a decade ago." Victor only smiled, because it never ended. It just changed locations. When Angelica handed Victor the thick file on the River Oaks HOA, along with Rodriguez's notes about the forced eviction of Mrs. Daniels, he didn't ask any questions. He flipped through a few pages, typed briefly on his computer, and spoke in a tone that was almost a command. If you want to redraw the power map, you start with the wire transfers. Angelica nodded. She knew how he worked, never trusted statements, and only followed the money. She left all the documents without setting a deadline. With Victor, everything had its own rhythm, and she never had to rush him. 3 days later, at exactly 6:30 a.m., Victor sent Angelica a single data file through a military-grade encrypted channel. Title, River_Oaks_Asset_Trail PP. When opened, Angelica saw a clean, chillingly detailed financial flowchart. Victor had traced 12 transactions in the past 24 months between the River Oaks HOA and a company named Blue Marlin Holdings, LLC. On paper, Blue Marlin was a residential asset brokerage firm, specializing in assisting neighborhoods with distressed properties and code violations. But Victor had found the anomaly. Every acquisition involved properties that were previously owned by Black or immigrant families. More critically, Blue Marlin wasn't acting independently. It was a subsidiary of Helena Property Group, a mid-sized real estate conglomerate headquartered in Austin, Texas. Victor had highlighted in red the name of Helena's second-largest shareholder, Amelia Whitman. Amelia, none other than the wife of Houston's current police chief, Samuel Whitman. Angelica wasn't surprised, yet she sat in silence for nearly 2 minutes, staring at the diagram. Victor video-called exactly 5 minutes later. His image appeared, face calm as always, with a bookshelf behind him, nothing out of place. They don't use cash. They use a restructuring fund, transferred from the HOA to Blue Marlin as complex asset management support, a name long enough to mask the real intent. Angelica asked, "How did you trace it back to Helena?" Victor held up his phone, showing an image of a bank appendix, a refinancing loan with a personal guarantor, Amelia Whitman. Commercial banks don't need to know who's behind the HOA, but money, it always tells you who's behind whom. Angelica exhaled softly, not from fatigue, but from the realization that a wall had just appeared and was starting to crack. What about the HOA board? Any direct links? Victor's lips curled slightly. Nothing concrete yet, but give me 48 more hours and I'll tell you who funded the current HOA president's campaign. Karen Monroe. Angelica nodded. She didn't need to repeat her thanks. Between them, truth was always the primary language. Victor took another 2 days. Not due to lack of tools, but because political donations were often hidden behind names clean enough to be ignored without question. When Angelica received the second analysis, it was only 8 pages long, but every line peeled back a layer. Helena Property Group, the entity behind Blue Marlin Holdings, had transferred a total of $1,800,000, 0 cents, over the past 2 years to a local political fund named Sustainable Houston PAC. On paper, the PAC operated independently, supporting election campaigns that encouraged civic participation in neighborhood planning. But when Victor traced it further, he uncovered 3 satellite organizations authorized by the PAC to distribute funds: a media firm, a women in HOA leadership advocacy group, and a community consulting team with no public member disclosure. All 3 shared the same origin account and legal address on the 3rd floor of Helena's main building. In the funding recipient list, Victor had marked a familiar name in red: Karen Monroe, current president of the River Oaks HOA. Her 2020 campaign record stated she accepted no donations from real estate businesses, but no law required her to disclose indirect ties through 3 organizational layers. When Angelica got to this part, she let out a quiet breath, then turned to the final page. Attached at the bottom was a photo from the Texas Southern University Law School archive. In the image were Karen Monroe and Samuel Whitman, now the Houston police chief, standing side by side, holding alumni achievement trophies, both honored with the Community Leadership Award in 2004. No article ever mentioned their connection after. No public record showed they'd worked together, but Victor had found the photo. Angelica folded the file. She wasn't angry, only a distinct kind of stillness, like someone who had just confirmed a systemic cancer and now had to decide whether to reveal the diagnosis. "This isn't community enforcement anymore," she said. "This is institutional collusion." Victor sat across the screen, voice even, no emphasis needed. "Real estate is money. HOA laws are the tools. Police, they clear the road." Neither of them spoke again. No conclusion was necessary, because once the links had formed a chain, the next step wasn't to ask questions. It was to sever the right link. The call came at 9:17 a.m. on Monday. The number had a Washington, D.C. area code, unfamiliar but not suspicious. The voice on the other end belonged to a female administrative officer, speaking with precise cadence and perfectly enunciated words. "Good morning. This is the Military Medical Review Board. We need to verify information regarding Commander Angelica Washington's post-deployment psychological reassessment file." Angelica froze, pen in hand, her brow furrowing. "I've never submitted any such request," she replied. The woman remained polite but showed no surprise. "We understand. However, the file was initiated through our internal system with a proposal code confirmed by the regional command. We're simply following procedure." Angelica requested a full copy, originator, reasoning, and all attached forms. She hung up, opened her encrypted laptop, and began checking the system herself, a reflex from her days in strategic response units. 1 hour later, the file arrived in her military inbox. 19 pages long, the header printed in bold capital letters. Psychological recess. Psychological recess. Senior Command Group, Code 43B. The first line read, "Subject of review, Washington, Angelica, Commander, MP, Southern Military District. Reason, signs of post-deployment psychological instability. Iraq, Phase 3. Increased emotional reactivity in high-stress civilian settings. Tendency to confront administrative and federal civilian authority." Angelica clenched her mouse. She flipped through the pages. Every paragraph was hauntingly familiar. The sentence rhythm, the manipulative tone, the suspicious phrasing. It reminded her of a specific kind of document, one that had ended the careers of multiple cadets at West Point. This wasn't a medical report. It was an attack on her honor, disguised as a clinical assessment. One line in the middle of the file stood out. "According to unofficial reports from peer-level personnel, Commander Washington demonstrated loss of control under political pressure in domestic residential zones. Angelica paused. No one in her unit used the phrase domestic residential zones except one person, and only one person ever drafted memos in this exact style, wordy, excessive detail, and always framing observation as suspicion. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Memories of West Point came rushing back, where she once confronted a cadet named Joseph Reiner for cheating during a simulated strategy exam. He had been suspended in his final semester and had never forgiven her for it. Angelica didn't need more evidence. She knew this wasn't an administrative error. It was a calculated attempt to discredit her on paper. Because when a black female officer is labeled mentally unstable, no one listens to what she says next. And if this report were approved, she would lose her operational command, her right to respond to the media, and her standing as a witness in any civil investigation. No one needed to prove her wrong, only convince others she was unstable. Angelica folded the file, placed it on the table like an unsigned death certificate. But her eyes no longer reflected defeat. They belonged to someone who had just confirmed the knife's direction and turned in time to face it. It didn't take long for her to trace the origin. With Victor's technical help, she tracked the internal coding within the military record system. Most medical files were generated automatically, based on recommendations from officers of equal or higher rank. But her file had been manually inserted. A mid-level internal account had entered a reassessment suggestion command, triggering the review board protocol. The account name? Rainer J_5. She stared at it for several seconds before confirming. Major Joseph Reiner, currently stationed at Southern Military Command, was her former post. His rank wasn't higher than hers, but it was sufficient to propose psychological evaluations in sensitive civilian engagement cases, a loophole in regulations few knew about. Reiner wasn't a stranger. Years ago, they were both cadets at West Point. He was brilliant, arrogant, and resented anyone who outperformed him. During their final year strategy simulation, Angelica caught him using predictive algorithms from a retired system, a serious violation. She reported him. He was suspended, denied early promotion, and flagged with an ethics warning in his record. Since then, there had been a cold silence between them that never truly ended. She still remembered his words after the internal hearing. Someone like her shouldn't represent the military, not because of skin color, but because of her self-righteousness. Back then, it passed her like a cold draft. Now it returned, a deliberate, piercing chill. Angelica kept digging. With Victor's financial network access, another connection emerged. Joseph Reiner was the brother-in-law of Sheriff Samuel Whitman, through marriage to Isabel Whitman, Samuel's younger sister. The couple had held a private wedding in Austin in 2018, never listed in any military or law enforcement personnel files. Angelica sat in silence. She understood the game. Reiner's reappearance wasn't a chance. The falsified medical file wasn't just a stab at her honor, it was a preemptive strategic strike. Being labeled mentally unstable post-deployment would strip her of credibility in the military and disable her ability to serve as a witness before the media, in court, or in any federal probe. No one needed to arrest her. They only had to make her voice untrustworthy with a medical stamp. Angelica placed her hand flat on the table. Everything went quiet, but in her mind a new map had formed. Reiner, Whitman, Karen, HOA, Helena Property Group, a closed loop, and she was standing right at its center. No one was trying to kill her. They were trying to kill her ability to be heard. But Angelica had survived war not with weapons, but with the resolve to never let the truth be rewritten. She whispered to herself, if they've chosen to revise the past to seal off the present, then I'll use the present to shatter every false record. West Point. Final winter term. Intense training sessions within simulated warfare where every decision was logged and graded like an actual battlefield. During the Joint Strategy Simulation exam, Angelica, then a mock platoon commander, was assigned to lead a combined operations unit, in direct opposition to Joseph Reiner's team. Reiner was known for his theoretical brilliance, was highly regarded by instructors, and was almost certain to graduate with early rank promotion. In the third round of the simulation, Angelica began noticing abnormal responses from the system whenever Reiner's team made battlefield decisions. Their accuracy was nearly perfect, even with missing input data. She requested clarification from the tech division. Initially, they called it tactical luck, but Angelica didn't believe in luck when it happened 3 times in a complex brigade-level wargame. She checked the system's access logs, a detail most cadets overlooked, and found that Reiner's account had accessed a deprecated simulation dataset, which had been banned the year before for including a tactical suggestion algorithm known to distort training results. Technically, that was cheating. In spirit, it violated the honor code underpinning the entire training system. Angelica didn't report him right away. She met Reiner after the simulation, presented the data, and asked directly, "You accessed restricted data. You still have a chance to make this right or withdraw." Reiner didn't deny it. He simply looked at her with an icy stare and said, "Who do you think you are in this system? A black girl who plays by the rules and thinks doing the right thing will earn her a medal? You're wrong. These rules weren't written for people like you." Angelica didn't respond. 2 days later, she filed a formal report. The academy launched an investigation. Reiner was suspended for his final semester. He didn't graduate with honors. He lost his candidacy for accelerated rank. He was removed from the list of strategic command prospects. He was reassigned to logistics, a career path that effectively ended in silence. Angelica never spoke of it again. She felt neither pride nor regret. To her, it had been a necessary decision, not about power, but principle. But Reiner never forgot. In his eyes, she wasn't someone who did the right thing. She was the one who destroyed the path that had been laid out for him. They never spoke again after West Point. No messages, no greetings at military events. Between them existed a quiet distance, unnamed but ever present, like a faint scratch on a service uniform. Angelica lived with that memory as something closed, but Reiner carried it like an unstitched wound. And now, he had decided to use it to rewrite her entire present. On regional defense television, Joseph Reiner appeared calm, crisp uniform, polished rank tabs, voice smooth like it was lifted from a civil military handbook. In interviews, he was introduced as Major, Strategic Advisor to the Southern Command, specializing in reintegration in the image of the modern soldier. Pro-government media called him a symbol of internal harmony, a soldier who sees both sides. But beneath the flowery language, he slipped in veiled warnings. We must be cautious of certain soldiers returning from combat with an overly adversarial mindset towards civilian agencies. This could stem from untreated psychological effects, and if unchecked, could harm the military's public image. He never said her name. He didn't have to. Just seeded the right terms. Hyper-reactive service member. Overreach, emotional instability, and the public would fill in the blank with the name they'd recently heard. Angelica Washington. Behind the scenes, Reiner wasn't acting alone. Through his wife, Isabel Whitman, sister of the Houston police chief, he had access to a network of local media, community channels, and blogs focused on military commentary. They began circulating unofficial posts suggesting that a female military police officer once investigated for exceeding authority in an upscale neighborhood was now undergoing a psychological reevaluation. No charges, no proof, just enough to shape the narrative, turning a personal dispute into a public doubt. Reiner didn't need to speak much. He just had to leak at the right moment so others could do the rest. Colleagues second-guessing, commanders hesitating, the media amplifying concerns, until eventually Angelica wouldn't have to do anything wrong to be treated like she already had. What Reiner didn't anticipate was that, for the first time in years, Angelica returned to West Point, not for support, but to request the original records from that case, the strategic simulation breach she had once exposed. She contacted the Academy's Honor Archive Division, invoking the clause for evidence retrieval under military inquiry review, and in a cold room lined with steel cabinets and documents typed on faded letterheads, she found the file titled J. Reiner Simulation Ethics Violation 2007. The copy didn't just include the Academy's investigative signatures. It also had Reiner's denied appeal. Handwritten. She doesn't understand that so-called principle means nothing if it costs a truly deserving man his opportunity. Angelica held the file without a word. Now she had something Reiner couldn't edit. A truth that existed before he ever tried to redefine honor. If Reiner had chosen to weaponize the past to take her down, then she would use that very past to unmask the version of himself he was selling. Not for revenge, but through the one thing he feared most, a truth he once tried to bury, now exposed, not loudly, just at the right moment. Tuesday afternoon. The summons arrived marked top secret priority, sent directly from the office of the Inspector General at the Department of Defense. The subject line was short and firm. Required presence, hearing room 6. Purpose, clarification of information affecting the honor of the force. No further details, no signatory, but Angelica knew when the military invites you to a room with no recording devices, it means they don't want anything left behind. Pentagon B2 level, internal hearing wing, room 6. When Angelica entered, 4 people were seated. 3 senior generals, not in dress uniform, just shirts with small name tags, and a young aide who took no notes and didn't look directly at anyone. No microphones on the table, no cameras, no screen. The room was cold, by design. The first to speak was Lieutenant General Marshall, in charge of strategic personnel. He didn't ask if Angelica had settled in, didn't restate the purpose. He just looked at her and said, "We know you're pursuing a complicated case, but at this moment the image and stability of the force matter more than any individual. The media is messy enough." The second voice belonged to Lieutenant General McKay, formerly of Army Command. Quieter, but no less pressing. "You're under watch. You're a target now. That's a fact. And if we're protecting you, you should protect us. Some things are best closed internally, for your career and for the force." No one mentioned Reiner, or HOA, or Karen, or the slap, or Marcus Chen's video. But in that room, it all had already been said, by the fact that no one said it aloud. Angelica didn't respond immediately. She looked at each man, not as if interrogating, but as if searching for any trace of humanity left behind the armor of rank. They didn't hate her. They didn't even hate the truth. What they hated was trouble. Anything that forced them to take a side they couldn't control. And right now, she was exactly that. One of them, General Roussel, folded his hands and leaned forward, his tone bordering on negotiation. "We don't want anyone removed. Not you, not anyone. But the public doesn't want the truth. They want a symbol. And if you continue, you'll become the wrong kind of symbol." Angelica tilted her head. "And if I stay silent, that makes me the right kind?" No one answered, but all 3 leaned back at once. A quiet retreat dressed up as calm. She'd stood on real battlefields, heard gunfire, lost comrades, but nowhere had she felt pressure more merciless than here, where the heads of a system spoke in low voices, downcast eyes, and precise wording that bent honor in the name of preserving it. Angelica understood. This wasn't a hearing. It was a proposal, a deal, where the price was her silence. She sat tall, didn't adjust her chair, didn't clasp her hands, didn't ask for clarification. In a room where everything hinged on tone and gaze, she chose the simplest tactic, steady breathing. No rush, no retreat. She looked directly at the man who spoke. If a female officer is beaten, defamed, and discredited, and the military stays silent to protect its image, then what image are we even protecting? The question wasn't bitter, it wasn't provocative, but it struck precisely where the generals didn't want to be touched. Because they knew some things can't be repainted with press releases. It can't be corrected with promotions. It can't be excused with the phrase, "for the greater good." One of the 3, an older general with silver hair and thin-rimmed glasses, exhaled slowly. Not full surrender, but unmistakable. He said, "You won't lose your rank, but you might lose your post, your command, your future." Angelica nodded, as if she'd heard that warning before in other rooms. Then she replied, not raising her voice, "I don't fight for a seat. I fight so the women who wear this uniform after me won't have to choose between honor and truth." The silence that followed wasn't like before. It wasn't cold or tense. It simply had nothing left to add. No one objected. No one agreed. But in that moment, the silence became acknowledgement. They couldn't change her, and they couldn't deny her. A quiet knock. The aide opened the door. No one walked her out. No one asked her to stay. No one issued a suspension or inquiry, at least not yet. But Angelica knew. In the military, real decisions never happen in the meeting. They happen after, in private calls, unlogged emails, and unlisted appointments. She stepped out. No rush, no misstep. The Pentagon hallway buzzed with movement, but no one noticed the officer walking alone. No political tags, no ceremonial badges, no assigned escort. Just a woman who had chosen the side without shelter. Angelica didn't look back, didn't check who saw, who noted, who would report, because what she'd just said and what they'd failed to answer was no longer a discussion, it was a line, between loyalty to order and loyalty to justice, between protecting the image and confronting reality. That line isn't drawn on paper, it's not in any code of conduct, but it exists, clear as the space between the ceiling and the sky, and Angelica had chosen the side without a ceiling, because only from there can you see the sky. Dr. Marcus Chen didn't choose the media. He didn't reach out to TV stations, nor did he use mainstream social networks. Instead, he uploaded a video to an independent academic platform, accompanied by a 14-page legal analysis. The title was simple: "The Incident at River Oaks, a Perspective on Constitutional Rights and Public Duty." No shocking images, no background music, no sensationalism. Just a short clip from a personal body cam, capturing Angelica Washington being stopped, questioned, and assaulted by two officers, Wilson and Thompson, in a neighborhood long praised for its peace. One of the officers looked directly into the camera and said, "We trust the HOA. You don't belong here." Below the video was a professionally formatted PDF. Marcus didn't use an accusatory tone. He cited legal statutes, federal case precedents, and civil rights protection acts. He compared Angelica's situation to lawful arrest procedures, pointing out more than 5 clear violations, from failure to read rights and confirm identity to the use of force against a non-threatening individual. In his conclusion, Marcus didn't mention Angelica's name. He simply wrote, "When an officer is treated as an intruder simply because of skin color, the problem no longer lies with the individual, it lies within the system." The impact exceeded all expectations. Within 6 hours, the video surpassed 2 million views, reshared by legal scholars, veterans, civil rights organizations, and even a group of retired military officers. The question echoed everywhere: who is the woman in the video? No names were given, but the uniform Angelica wore answered for itself. At Houston Police Headquarters, that morning was unlike any other. The media department received over 600 emails in just 1 hour. The city council called an emergency closed session. Reporters began digging into the identities of the two officers, and on Captain Whitman's desk sat 3 unopened investigation files, never previously requested. He stayed silent for 2 hours. When his assistant stepped in and asked, "What's the next move, sir?" he didn't answer. He simply stared at his computer screen, frozen on the frame where Angelica stood up after the blow, blood on her cheek, eyes without resentment, just watching. Angelica gave no interviews, no comments, no confirmation or denial, but she quietly sent copies of the clip to Zoe, to Victor, and to one other person, the only one who had once told her silence is a weapon, if aimed correctly. Angelica was sitting in her living room at 8:42 p.m. when the landline rang, the old ringtone she had never changed since moving into River Oaks. She looked at the screen. No caller ID. She picked up without hesitation. "What do you think you're doing?" A male voice, low, calm, as if reading from an old script in a play that never ended. Angelica didn't respond and waited a few seconds. "That video, If it spreads any further, you'll lose more than a few bruises." A glass clinked softly against the wooden table, too clean a sound to be accidental. "I thought you were smarter than this, Angelica." She let out a quiet laugh, not from amusement. "And I thought you were smart enough not to repeat yourself." Silence on the other end, 3 full seconds. Short for most people, long for someone used to controlling the script. His voice returned, softer but not gentler. "Don't forget, you're no longer in uniform when you face civilian law." Angelica glanced at the photo of her father, uniformed during the Iraq campaign in 2003, hanging quietly on the wall. She said, her voice no louder than usual, "And you can't hide your hand when the blood carries the print." She hung up, no waiting for a reply. No need for names. The caller didn't need to introduce himself, and she didn't need to ask. Some voices had once echoed through military hallways, into classified briefings, into late-night budget debates, and now returned like a trigger to her survival instinct. She logged the call time in an old notebook, not a computer. 8:42 p.m., 5 minutes, 31 seconds. Male voice, American, approximately 50 years old. She knew exactly who he was. Not Captain Whitman, not Chief Anderson. He didn't need an official title because he was the one who decided who got one. Angelica poured a glass of water, sat back at the table, and opened Rodriguez's file. Backups of internal emails never made public. One line, handwritten by Rodriguez, read, "Don't say anything, just keep it safe." Angelica read carefully. Sudden transfer orders, disciplinary reports were leaked. Some lines clearly stated, "Recommend no documentation." Verbal relay through intermediary command. Short lines, sharp, but clearer than any formal accusation. She turned on the printer and printed 2 copies with no file saved. One for Victor, one for Zoe. In war, some things are never stored digitally, because not all wars involve explosions. Some begin with a threat in a living room, and some begin with a call that doesn't need to come from a stranger. That night, when she turned off the lights to sleep, the phone still sat on the table. No one called again, but the bell had rung, and no one in that system could pretend they didn't hear it. 3 days after Marcus's video went viral, a surprise property inspection took place at the small bakery Angelica's parents had run for over 2 decades in South Houston. 3 inspectors in white shirts showed up carrying zoning maps, floor meters, and food safety logbooks. They arrived unannounced and did not leave after the inspection. At 11 a.m., Mrs. Evelyn, Angelica's mother, called her. "Do you know what's going on? They said the 2003 land certificate was never updated with your father's name." Angelica asked to speak with the lead inspector. The man's tone was cold, administrative. "We're acting under directive to investigate asset misfiling in pre-zoned civilian redevelopment areas." Angelica asked, "Who issued the directive?" He hesitated, then answered, "Civil Real Estate Coordination Office, No. 4. She didn't need to search Google to know it was a front for the company chaired on paper by Chief Anderson's wife, and that her family's bakery, long under the radar, was now suddenly on a list for land use repositioning. Not a coincidence. Not after a video, not after a phone call. Angelica calmed her mother, said she'd handle it. After the call, she texted Victor. "They've started with my home. Project name VRS4. Track its financial source." Inside her was a quiet fury, tightly coiled like wire. Not because they'd come for her, but because they touched the kitchen where she first learned to tell right from wrong. Not by law, but by her father's eyes. Later that same day, when Angelica returned to her apartment in River Oaks, the front door was untouched, no signs of forced entry, but the safe in her study had been opened. She checked, and classified documents were intact. Laptop untouched, but the velvet-lined wooden box where she kept her military medals was gone. 2 Purple Hearts, 1 Distinguished Service, and her MP Special Forces badge, engraved with her serial number. No note, no paper trail, no ransacked drawers. The thief hadn't come for anything else. Just one thing, the symbol of her honor. Angelica didn't call the police. She stood silently, staring at the empty spot where the box had rested. Not afraid, not angry, just certain they had acted in a way that couldn't be walked back. She turned on the soft yellow light in her study. No need to double-check. A soldier's memory never forgets the exact placement of medals. She had polished them weekly with lint-free cloths arranged left to right. Valor, service, sacrifice. Not for appearance, but because it reminded her justice should never be built on pain first. But now they were gone. Not for money, not for material value, but for a message. Your honor is no longer a weapon. She still didn't call the police. Filing a complaint now would only tell them she was shaken. But she wasn't. Instead, she pulled a small USB drive from a hidden drawer, containing scans of all her medals, certificates, and federally confirmed mission reports. She sent copies to Zoe, Victor, and Marcus, the note attached. They took the real ones, but what truly scares them is the reason I earned them. At night, Angelica went to her parents' house. No warning. Mr. James was packing electrical tools at the bakery, fluorescent lights flickering above. They came, didn't they? He asked without looking up. Angelica nodded. They took all my medals. He didn't flinch, just stood straight, wiped his hands with a coarse towel and said, "Good. Means they know you're exactly where you should be." Mrs. Evelyn made tea. Angelica sipped it slowly. The ginger and mint scent brought back memories of the time she was saved from a minefield by the faint click of a zipper, details only survivors learn to hear. And this time the enemy wasn't across a border. It was here, at home. Before leaving, she opened her car trunk and took out a small box. Not a weapon. Replica medals made of hard plastic, the kind she used to train recruits in how to tell real from fake. She placed them on the shelf where the real ones had been, not to replace them, but to remind the intruders. They could steal metal, but never meaning. As dawn approached, Angelica sat at her laptop. She began drafting a letter, not to the press, but to every former officer listed in the Region 7 Veterans Network, those she had trained, commanded, and once saved. The first line she typed, slowly, deliberately, read, "If honor is the only thing keeping us on course, then who stands when it's taken away?" Outside, darkness still clung, but Angelica knew this fight was no longer hers alone. Zoe Franklin found the lead on a night she hadn't planned to search. A light rain was falling. The smell of stale coffee lingered in her third brewed porcelain cup. Her screen displayed hundreds of maintenance and improvement contracts issued by HOAs in River Oaks over the past 3 years. She wasn't digging into police files, nor was she tracing banking trails. She was just repeating one tedious task: cross-referencing company names, code numbers, contract dates, contractors, and appendix expenses. One name appeared for the 4th time, and her fingers froze. Oriole Assets Management, LLC. It sounded innocuous. No flair, nothing suspicious, but something about it was too clean. No signage, no website, no staff profiles, no listed representatives, and yet this name had signed a series of high-value contracts, from internal landscaping consultations to temporary relocation oversight. Zoe didn't need 3 clicks to pull back the curtain. The financial registration address matched the family law office of Cynthia Anderson, wife of Police Chief Anderson. On paper, Oriole was owned by a woman named Linda May Connors, a neutral name with no legal red flags. But Linda May had been an administrative staffer in Cynthia's office for over 11 years and had never left the city, a shell built to avoid attention, because no one would think to look. Zoe leaned back, staring at the screen like staring into a habit. They always think they can't be traced. She chuckled, not out of triumph, but at the careless arrogance that years of unchecked power breed. She dialed Angelica. 1:20 a.m. We can trace the money. The HOA isn't just residential. It's the civilian arm of the sheriff. Silence followed on the other end. No. Are you sure? Like other clients, Angelica simply said, "Get all the contracts. Print 3 copies." The next morning, Marcus Chen's kitchen turned into an analysis lab. Documents stacked in layers, each labeled. Detailed contracts, transaction logs, real estate appendices, personnel links. Angelica sat at the far end of the table, fingers resting on a red-marked page. Victor sat in the corner, eyes locked on a sentence underlined in bold. Community coordination, temporary supervision, and resolution of residential discrepancies from a $190,000 0 cents maintenance contract signed between Oriel and the HOA last year. Harmless on the surface, but everyone in the room understood resolution here wasn't a grammatical term. Victor looked up. You know what this means, don't you? Angelica nodded. It's not relocation. It's cleansing, Zoe added quietly, voice lower, as if afraid of stating something too obvious. And this time, they're not using the law, they're using the HOA. Police don't need to evict anyone themselves. They just make the residents feel like they don't belong. She slid out a contract dated March 12, just weeks before Angelica's incident. It included a budget item for building a feedback and access coordination mechanism at gate entries, which meant giving the HOA the power to randomly inspect anyone entering River Oaks. No police needed. No official suspicion, just a strange fate. Angelica flipped each page like someone unpacking old ammunition, knowing exactly what she'd find but needing to feel it in her hands. She stopped at a list of residential discrepancies, annotated with initials and house numbers. One of them was the former address of Nathan Bell, a former Marine who was forced out after 6 months for aesthetic disruption to community standards. Angelica looked up. Her expression had moved beyond determination. Now it resembled a verdict waiting to be delivered. There's no doubt. This is racial cleansing, disguised as civil contracts. Silence cloaked the room. No verbal consensus needed. The three of them understood. This time, they had found the real nerve center of the web. The man who knocked on Marcus Chen's door at exactly 10 a.m. the next morning was black, middle-aged, broad-shouldered, shaved head, wearing a dark, worn t-shirt. He didn't give a long introduction. He simply handed over a thin binder. Printed emails between him and the River Oaks HOA from 3 years prior. His voice was steady and low, his eyes not filled with anger but something deeper. The exhaustion of someone who had fought long enough to stop expecting victory. My name is Nathan Bell. I used to live in South River Oaks, Del Mar Street. He sat down, nodded to each person at the table, then looked straight at Angelica. I'm a former Marine, served from 2003 to 2009. After discharge, I used my support funds to buy my first home for my mother. Zoe flipped through the binder, scanning the dates. One letter from the HOA to Nathan read, Although your home meets technical standards, it no longer aligns with the neighborhood's architectural direction. We suggest initiating a dialogue for a smooth transition. Nathan gave a dry laugh. They didn't take the house, they just made daily life unbearable. Weekly gas checks, notices for faulty gate lights, fines for late lawn trims, penalties for guests parking slightly wrong, fines for using sun tarps that were off-tone. He turned another page. I served in Fallujah, Iraq. Bullets never made me run. But my mother's eyes, when she said, I'm tired, can we move? That's when I knew I'd lost the war at home. Angelica watched him for a long moment. She didn't ask, why didn't you sue? The answer was in his calm demeanor, in the understanding of a soldier who knew some battles are built to drain you, not let you win. Victor handed him a glass of water. No one said anything more. Angelica finally spoke. Thank you for coming. And this time, no one's getting pushed out. Nathan nodded and placed the folder on the table. I still have the purchase contract, the payment records, and photos of what happened afterward. I know it's not enough to sue, but maybe enough to redraw the map. Zoe looked at Angelica, then at the red-headed phrase in the contract. Resolution of residential discrepancies. See Section 6C. At that moment, the phrase no longer felt vague. It now had a face, a voice, and a living story. Angelica walked over and shook Nathan's hand. Firmly. They thought they could erase your name from a neighborhood. They never imagined you'd come back to erase their entire system. No slogans, no cameras. But in that moment, in a quiet kitchen, the battle Angelica carried no longer belonged to her alone. This time, they didn't just have documents. They had a living witness, someone who had once been erased from the map. 8:00 a.m. Angelica received the call. The woman's voice on the other end didn't tremble. didn't sob, but something in each measured word felt like it had been practiced all night. I don't know you, but I think my son did. He wrote about you in his journal. Before Angelica could speak, the woman continued. My name is Clarissa Monroe. If you are free this morning, I'd like to meet. There's something I don't think should belong to me, but maybe shouldn't exist at all. Not in an office, not at a private residence. They met in the reading room of a county library, where the soft yellow lights blurred time's sharp edges. Clarissa came alone. No lawyer, no recorder, no escort, just a worn fabric bag and a leather-bound journal with a folded corner. She placed the bag on the table calmly, opened the journal, and began. No introductions needed. My son's name was Darius Monroe. He worked night deliveries for a West Side grocery chain. In 2020, during a late shift, he was shot while pushing a cart out of the store. Clarissa didn't lower her gaze. She didn't cry. Her voice was steady, unapologetic. The officer said he looked like a wanted suspect. There was no warrant, no weapon found, no working cameras near the cart zone, no evidence. Just a feeling. Angelica accepted the journal with both hands, a reflex shaped by years of memorial ceremonies. The early pages were neat, structured, and written by a young man trying to bring order to a world that denied him permission to do so. Job notes, daily routines. But midway through, a red sticky note marked a single entry. Clarissa said nothing. Angelica opened it. If one day I'm killed just because of my skin, let my death be the final blow against injustice. Don't let it be another silent red stain on a report. Angelica looked up, but Clarissa didn't meet her gaze. Her eyes were fixed on the dust-lit window. She didn't need to see a reaction. She had lived with those words for 3 years. They weren't a sentence anymore. They were bone. Darius wrote about River Oaks. He didn't live there, but he delivered weekly. He told me every time he walked into that neighborhood, he had to breathe slower, walk lighter, and avoid eye contact. He once said, in that place, just existing makes people want to check you. Do you understand that feeling, Lieutenant Colonel? Angelica nodded, softly but firmly. I do, ma'am. Clarissa turned to her. There was no blame, no hope, just recognition. I didn't come for justice. I came because if he were alive, he'd stand with you. He wasn't a fighter, but he hated silence. Angelica said nothing. She placed her hand gently on the journal, like holding a fallen comrade's weapon, even if he'd never worn a uniform. When Clarissa left the library, Angelica remained seated, in a room with no alarms, no cameras, no news crews, but with one truth clearly present. The first person killed in this operation now had a name, and the first to hide it was about to lose their curtain. By noon, the air inside Franklin's law office was as heavy as a pre-war strategy room. No coffee, no whiteboard, just a dark wooden table with copies of the journal neatly laid out. The original was sealed in nylon, sitting in the center, like the heart of a case that had never been filed. Angelica didn't recount the meeting with Clarissa. She didn't need to. The proof was right there, not a deposition, but a handwritten whisper. She opened the marked page, read aloud, word for word. Nothing skipped. When she finished, the room stayed frozen. Marcus leaned back, hands locked, eyes on the ceiling if trying to recall a name long buried. Victor closed his eyes for 3 seconds, lips tightened, not with anger, but the quiet of a man who'd seen soldiers fall, not from error, but because an entire system chose silence. Zoe exhaled, light but audible, the kind of breath that confirmed something you always feared but never dared name. This isn't just a record. This is testimony. Rodriguez, who once tore up a transfer form because he couldn't stomach buried reports, flipped through more pages. A blue ink entry sat between mundane job notes. HOA once called about my black gloves. They said they looked unfriendly. I've been asked my name 3 times in the same neighborhood. I know I don't belong there, but I also know one day someone won't bow their head. Rodriguez read the final line again, then looked at Angelica. He didn't ask a question, didn't add a theory. You're that person. Angelica didn't respond, didn't confirm, didn't deny. Her eyes simply fell to the final line of the journal, a sentence lightly crossed, then rewritten in red ink. like an echo made permanent. "Don't let me die" as a footnote. She gently closed the journal, her palm resting on the cover. No press, no cameras, no human rights panels. But they all knew. What they held was a verdict, not for Darius Monroe, but for a system that turned his death into data. Zoe stood, sliding forward a stack of documents. She laid them before Angelica and pointed to a funding chart from Oriole Asset Management, the shell company tied to the police chief's wife. Community response funds began spiking in Q2 of 2020, the exact quarter Darius was shot. No recipient names, just local oversight partners. Zoe lowered her voice. They weren't just purging, they were testing, and now we know the name of the first to be erased. Angelica placed the journal back in a moisture-proof case, not out of fear of losing evidence, but because to her this wasn't evidence. It was a will, a kind of will that didn't need notarization, written in blood, in death, in a question left unanswered for too long. She spoke slowly, like speaking to someone still present behind her. "Your name won't be a footnote. It'll be in the indictment." No one added anything. They didn't need to. They all understood. From this moment, retaliation was no longer a strategy, it was a duty, and this duty already had blood to guide its path. The hearing began at 9 a.m. at the federal courthouse in Houston. Hall 3B. No more press briefings, silent clips, or leaked reports. This was the first time everything was made public, with the presence of members of Congress, representatives from the Department of Justice, the State Police Oversight Agency, and the press, lined up since 6 a.m. Some carried printed timelines, others came with marked notebooks, ready not to speculate, but to document history as it unfolded. Angelica entered the room not in uniform, bearing no insignia, just a white blouse, dark blazer, and neatly tied hair. Yet something about her presence made the room fall silent for a few seconds as she walked in, not the presence of a witness, but of someone who had once carried a battlefield and now brought with her a different kind of war, a war between memory and distorted truth. Her walk was deliberate, not dramatic. She was not there to perform, she was there to testify. Beside her was Zoe, holding a file divided into clearly labeled sections. Marcus sat close to the press row, saying nothing, only there to show that what would be shown today had the word of another soldier behind it. Boone sat at the end of the table, the only one in an old police uniform, without badges, but the pocket still bore the thread marks where his rank insignia used to be. The weight of absence was itself a statement. Chairing the hearing was Congresswoman Caroline Hayes, a white lawmaker whose campaign had once been built on the message of transparent security. She carried the look of someone who had once believed the system could fix itself, and now knew better. When introducing Angelica, she didn't read a bio. No titles were listed. She simply said, "The next speaker remains silent for the sake of her institution. But today, she chooses to speak for the people." Angelica stepped up, looked directly at the 14 panel members. No papers, no projector. She began with one sentence. "I'm not here to apologize, justify, or negotiate. I'm here to confirm what the entire city already knows, but what the system has denied." No tremble in her voice, just gravity. She then presented copies of contracts between the River Oaks HOA and Oriole Asset Management, demonstrating how funding had been funneled into so-called community renewal projects disguised as infrastructure upgrades. She displayed the original video Marcus had filmed, time-stamped and geolocated. She named the officers involved, presented evidence of implicit threats, falsified post-combat psychological reports, and the scanned, encrypted, and verified handwritten journal of Darius Monroe. No one interrupted, no one rushed to ask questions, no dramatic effects were needed, no harsh tone. Angelica didn't need to emphasize, because the truth carries its own weight, and when delivered without adornment, it lands heavier than any scripted plea. Zoe spoke next, for only 3 minutes. "Everything you need to know is already in your hands, but what you must confront is why people like Angelica, Rodriguez, Nathan Bell are never believed when they tell the truth." Her voice was calm, Her words were clipped and clear. She didn't push the panel. She simply handed them the mirror. The air was tight, like a surface waiting to shatter, and right then, Boone stood and asked to speak. His tone wasn't raised, but every syllable felt like sandpaper on stone. He opened a leaked internal memo from 3 years ago, documenting a meeting between the River Oaks HOA and representatives from the Houston Police Department, attended by a name no one expected to hear. Boone read aloud, minutes dated July 14, 2020. Proposal to initiate a residential internal control model, proposed, and media backed by HOA chairwoman Karen L. Hoffman. The name Karen L. Hoffman rippled through the hearing room like a gunshot without bullets, the kind that wounds not by sound, but by the silence that follows. Karen, the president of the River Oaks HOA, who once called the police on Angelica for not belonging here, was now officially tied to the phrase, initiator of the internal residential control model. For a moment, several members of the panel glanced at one another. Faces that had remained neutral began to shift. They weren't surprised by the system, but no one expected a woman who looked so media-friendly to be the linchpin. Zoe pushed another file into the center of the table. We have evidence that Karen Hoffman was a co-founder of a policy advocacy group named Safe Neighbors Now. On paper, it provides consulting to upscale neighborhoods on how to maintain internal harmony. In reality, it served as a shell for what was called the Golden Zone campaign. She pointed to the budget report. Primary funding came from Oriole Asset Management. Local oversight, handled by the HOA, is chaired by Karen. Angelica remained still. She didn't need to say another word. In that moment, every justification ever offered for the handcuffs, the suspicious stares, the perception of her presence as a threat, crumbled, because a face had now been tied to the plan. This was no longer a momentary lapse or a subjective reaction from officers on scene. It was architecture, with a designer and a name. A congressman asked, "Where is Mrs. Hoffman now?" Boone answered without blinking, "She's under temporary protection, awaiting summons. But the current evidence is sufficient to initiate a criminal investigation into organized civil abuse of power." The room did not erupt, but something deeper happened. The silence shifted from uncertainty to reckoning. Marcus spoke up for the first time during the entire hearing. "She didn't make a mistake. She designed it. That's the difference." His voice, forged in military cadence, didn't rise. It landed, like an oath that didn't need a flag. A large screen behind them lit up with a diagram compiled by Victor's team, mapping the connections between HOAs, disbursements from city funds, and neighborhoods with disproportionately high rates of minority displacement. It all traced back to one template, stored under the internal code name, Initiative K, the Golden Zone. K equals Karen. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. Congresswoman Hayes tapped her pen on the table. "As a state representative, I will formally request the Department of Justice to review the entire HOA model across Texas. And until there is a clear conclusion, I recommend suspending all financial partnerships between the city and internally governed residential organizations." The statement didn't carry applause. It carried a trajectory. Zoe lightly squeezed Angelica's shoulder under the table. Not because they had won, but because they had reached the point where the truth could no longer be walked back. No one could deny Karen's role as a core operator of the manipulative machinery. Angelica raised her head and looked straight at the press for the first time. She didn't smile. She didn't pose as a hero. She simply let them see. The face of resistance had been revealed, but so had the face of the one who started the campaign. And now that both faces were clear, justice was no longer an idea. It had a face, a name, a date of summons, and a room that would remember, not because it was told to, but because it had seen enough not to forget. No one in the hearing room expected the next person to rise to be Rodriguez. He had been sitting in the witness support row, hands clasped, barely blinking all morning. But when the committee concluded its questioning about the HOA and Oriole Asset Management, Rodriguez requested to speak. He didn't wait to be called. He simply stood. "Permission to speak," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I'm Officer Rodriguez, badge number HPD 2944. I previously served in the Internal Affairs Division of the Houston Police Department." A short pause. "I'm standing here today to admit that I was once ordered to erase a record." The room fell breathless. The sudden absence of sound was not just from surprise, it was reverence, the kind given to those who carry a burden heavy enough to break most men. Rodriguez looked at no one. He looked down at a paper copy in his hands, the title barely legible, Civil Complaint Report, File No, DS 1121. He held it up and placed it on the hearing table. "This is the original complaint from an incident in River Oaks 3 years ago, concerning a resident who reported being physically searched for wearing attire deemed incompatible with the surrounding environment." The language itself was clinical, sanitized, but the violence behind it wasn't. Rodriguez continued, steady as if rehearsed. "But this wasn't a performance. It was an act of release. I was instructed by a superior, whose name I won't mention here, to delete this complaint from the system on the grounds of duplicate reporting. I complied. I'm not proud of that." He looked up, eyes slightly red. "But today, seeing the name Darius Monroe, I can't help but wonder, if we had kept that first file, things might have gone differently." The room didn't just listen, it absorbed the weight of a door long locked, now being opened from within. A hearing committee member asked, "Do you have proof of who issued the deletion order?" Rodriguez silently opened his briefcase, pulling out a printed internal email, sender's name redacted, but IP address, timestamp, and verification string intact. "The original remains in the system. I kept a copy in case it was tampered with." A murmur rippled through the press gallery. The chairperson tapped their pen, but no one could contain the weight in the room. A confession from an internal affairs officer was no longer just information. It was a fracture point, a breach not in the law, but in the silence that had protected it. Angelica looked at Rodriguez, not as an ally, but like someone watching a soldier strip off their armor in the middle of enemy fire. Vulnerability, when chosen, had a sound, and this was it. Boone stood up next. He didn't say, "I support this." He simply said, "I have something to add." Boone didn't bring a laptop, nor a USB. He pulled out an old file folder from his leather case, the paper yellowed, corners taped multiple times. It looked like a forgotten admin file from some dusty archive, but Boone held it like a verdict against a system that had long absolved itself. "This is an internal affairs report from the Houston Police Department, dated 2017. Case: an officer accused of racial profiling during an enforcement action in Highland Park. The complainant was a black mother of 3, evicted for environmental non-compliance. The reason? Her children were playing soccer in the rain, muddying public grass." The room went still. Not even the reporters typed. Boone flipped to page 2, pointing at a highlighted section. "Internal conclusion: no violation found, but recommend soft disciplinary response to preserve agency image." The person who authored that conclusion, do you want to guess? It was Officer Joseph Reiner, now a major, and at the time working directly with the River Oaks HOA on their initial draft for the Neighborhood Resident Control Initiative. Zoe nodded slowly. "We learned earlier that Karen launched it from the civilian side. This man was the enabler from law enforcement." Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. "The truth had already arrived," Boone continued. "It didn't stop there. These are 2 archive reports, saved in a legacy format, hidden from internal search since 2019. They require high-level system credentials to access." He handed over a thick stack of A4 printouts to the chair. Inside is the full data set for Operation Gold Zone, the proposal drafts, targeted area maps, statistical breakdowns of disproportionately penalized black residents, and police presence, frequency by address, matching households later advised to vacate. The crowd behind stirred, but this time it wasn't skepticism, it was recognition. No one called this a coincidence anymore. No one said possibly procedural error. What Boone laid out was systemic wrongdoing, patterned calculated. And the most chilling part was his tone. Calm, unembellished, no dramatics. Only numbers, signatures, IP addresses, passwords retrieved via internal audit codes, facts, so plain they became impossible to escape. Angelica looked toward the chair. Representative Hayes gave a near-instinctive nod, the kind made when denial was no longer possible. The hearing committee will recess for 5 minutes to verify this evidence, after which we will forward the full case to the U.S. Department of Justice. Rodriguez sat back down, not proud, but no longer ashamed. He didn't look for approval, only air. Boone didn't pat anyone on the back. He quietly gathered his documents, like a man who'd done his part in a war without medals. His calm wasn't detachment, it was duty fulfilled. Angelica looked at them. Those who had once stayed silent, now standing in the light, not for gain, but because living past someone else's death without looking back was no longer bearable. It was not about heroism. It was about accountability, borne by those who had the most to lose by speaking. No one applauded, but the entire hearing chamber was still, because none of the committee members had expected that the ones who once kept quiet were the ones who understood best how the system had bent justice out of shape. And when the room finally exhaled, it wasn't relief, it was the sound of something ancient shifting, of a structure long immune to reckoning beginning, at last, to be named. Just 2 days after the hearing, Officer Wilson, the one who struck Angelica in the street, was arrested on 3 charges: abuse of power, racially motivated assault, and violation of state-level police procedures. The arrest wasn't carried out by the Houston Police Department, but by a federal oversight task force from the Department of Justice, Region 5 office. No special treatment was granted. Wilson was taken from his home in front of the press, still wearing workout clothes, hands cuffed behind his back. When asked if he had anything to say, he replied with one sentence: "I was following orders from the top." But this time, no one in the system stepped forward to shield him. Not his chief, not his union, not even the backroom voices who once whispered the right names to protect the wrong ones. He stood alone, and for the first time, it mattered. That same evening, Karen Hoffman, the president of the River Oaks HOA, was officially indicted on 2 counts: establishing an organized discriminatory framework and abusing a civil post to coordinate structural injustice. Her attorney tried to shift the blame toward the police chief, claiming she was manipulated. But the financial records and internal meeting notes Zoe had gathered rendered every defense meaningless. Her network, once confident and insulated, began to scatter. Contractors pulled back. Board members resigned. The polished emails and sanitized meeting minutes couldn't withstand the weight of one unspoken truth, now finally spoken aloud. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was designed. Within 24 hours, the 2 people who once controlled the entire neighborhood and the language of legalized exclusion were placed in the same position they had forced onto people of color, interrogated, surveilled, and featured in headlines labeled community disturbance suspects. They were no longer the gatekeepers of safety. They became the evidence that something beneath the facade had always been broken. From there, the domino effect began. Press outlets across multiple states launched investigative reports on HOA models, not just in Houston, but also in Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, and Illinois, where communities of color were frequently pressured to sell homes, voluntarily relocate, or be fined for ambiguous infractions like aesthetic incompatibility. What had long passed as standards were now being re-examined as coded exclusion. The curtain of professionalism was drawn back, and behind it, a machinery of quiet removal. One newspaper used a chilling headline: "The HOA Model, When Discrimination is Written in the Language of Zoning." At Houston Police Headquarters, the air was heavy, like waiting for a collapsing building. Officers avoided eye contact. Files, once buried, started appearing on desks. And on Tuesday morning, an internal email from Chief Anderson was sent out. "I'm stepping down from my current position, effective immediately. for health reasons and in the interest of the department. But less than 6 hours later, an official DOJ statement followed. William Anderson will be investigated as a suspect in coordinated abuse of office involving systemic racial discrimination. Angelica read the news while making tea for her mother. Evelyn simply said, "Even the system must be tired of itself by now." The comment wasn't sarcastic. It was weary, like someone who had seen this storm gather too many times and finally watched it break. When William Anderson submitted his retirement on Tuesday morning, he still hoped his exit would be a footnote in the city's history. But by that afternoon, he was asked to return his state judicial credentials. No one stepped in to preserve his image, no final press conference, no public thanks, just silence, and then distance. In previous crises, there would be someone to absorb the fallout, a deputy, an inspector general, a council commissioner, someone to shield the top. But this time, no one moved, because everyone knew defending Anderson would unravel the whole web, and in that web, too many had signed papers, approved budgets, or simply stayed silent at the right moments. The chain of complicity was longer than anyone wanted to admit, and this time it was visible. That night, Angelica appeared in a live interview on PBS, her first national television appearance. She didn't retell the incident. She didn't name Wilson. She didn't mention Karen or Anderson. She simply said, "Make no mistake, this is not about hunting individuals. It's about peeling away the system that protected them for so long they believed they were the law." The studio was quiet. The moderator said nothing, because there was nothing more to add. Within 2 days of broadcast, dozens of resident committees nationwide were asked to publish their internal policies. Many that once proudly branded themselves model neighborhoods fell silent. Emails went unanswered. Websites quietly deleted slogans. The system didn't crack from a single strike, but from pieces like Rodriguez, Boone, Zoe, Marcus, Nathan, Clarissa, people standing on the lower levels of truth who, together, collapsed the upper floors. Zoe received an email from a retired city coordinator who had once resigned early due to irreconcilable differences over HOA policy implementation. His final line read, "I used to think no one was left standing, but today I see clearly. There's no one left in the middle, only those who stand tall and those being pulled down." Houston police began a full internal audit of all dismissed cases from the past 5 years, a move without precedent. Every deleted report, every buried complaint, every procedure not followed was now being re-examined. No one remained in the middle to smooth transitions or contextualize special cases. For the first time in decades, ambiguity had lost its seat at the table. Inside Franklin Law's office, Angelica looked through the window. Houston's streets were still busy as always, but for the first time, under the yellow glow of evening, she no longer saw the system as an untouchable fortress. She saw it as a decaying house. And finally, someone had knocked hard enough to break the wall. She turned to Zoe, her voice calm but firm. "We can't fix the entire city, but we did do one thing." Zoe smiled and nodded gently. "We made sure the truth doesn't have to stand alone anymore. And in a world so skilled at polishing silence, that, more than anything, was a beginning." Monday morning, the Department of Defense issued an official directive. Angelica Washington was promoted to lieutenant colonel, effective immediately, along with a formal commendation for upholding military honor in a politically sensitive civil conflict. At the internal promotion ceremony, Angelica invited no press, made no speech. When asked if she had any words for younger officers, she simply said, "Honor doesn't live in your rank. It lives in how you carry yourself when the uniform's gone." After the ceremony, media requests poured in. National TV producers called her an inspiring black figure in a divided America. One show pitched her as the hero in a fractured city. Some even sent advance questions. "How do you forgive those who once tried to break you?" Angelica read them, then deleted them, one by one. 3 NGOs, 2 elite scholarship foundations, 1 top-ranking military journal, and a national talk show all wanted the same thing, her story, her face. The headline, "A woman of color takes on the system and wins." But Angelica said nothing, not from humility, not from fear, but because she understood the battle hadn't ended. It had only changed form. That evening, she left her River Oaks apartment, the scene of her assault, the place that once made her walk slower and breathe smaller. It was also the reason Darius Monroe once wrote his final words, "Don't let me die," as a footnote. When she shut the door behind her, Angelica carried only 3 things: her uniform, a copy of the hearing file, and Darius's journal, the one Clarissa Monroe had placed into her hands. She didn't walk away from the spotlight to disappear. She walked back into the dark. Angelica moved to Southfield, a quiet working-class neighborhood on the city's edge. No HOA raids, no early morning ID checks, no suspicion at the coffee shop. She didn't choose a house, nor the military housing she was offered. She rented a 1-bedroom apartment with a low shelf and an old wooden table, just wide enough to hold 3 open case files. No medals on the wall, no portraits, just one white sheet of paper taped above her desk in black marker. "Don't let me die," as a footnote. It was more than a quote. It was a promise to keep memory alive, to resist the quiet erasure of names and lives that didn't fit the narrative. On her first morning in Southfield, she walked to the county-run community center, once gutted by budget cuts, now short on instructors for youth life skills classes. She didn't sign up with a rank or credentials. She just wrote, "Angelica teaches basic legal response." The manager asked, "Are you really a lieutenant colonel?" She smiled, neither confirming nor denying. "I just survived telling the truth." And in that moment, truth had no rank, just reach. Every Thursday, she taught 15 students, mostly kids suspended or flagged for defiance against school officers. No projector, no lecture slides, just dialogue. What silence means, how to ask for a lawyer, what a legal search actually looks like. But above all, no one has the right to make you feel wrong just because your existence unsettles them. She didn't quote law from textbooks. She taught it like a second language, one built from caution, survival, and voice. Her return wasn't in the news, but the first person to appear in class was Nathan Bell, the former Marine evicted from River Oaks. He sat quietly in the back. After class, he approached her and said, "You don't have to keep doing this. You could rest now." Angelica looked at him and replied, "I don't do it because I have to. I do it because I can't not do it." Her voice was steady, not noble, just honest. A week later, Clarissa Monroe visited. She didn't speak during the lesson. She simply listened, then left behind a fresh journal, blank except for a line on the cover, for the next person to write what hasn't yet been said. She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. Some contributions aren't meant to be seen, only carried forward. No media, no fanfare, but in that room where young black students learned the difference between law and power, truth no longer needed applause. It just needed someone who stayed. Angelica never chose to be a symbol. She chose to be a witness, not to inspire, but to preserve. And each night in that quiet apartment, she still flipped through her files, not for fame, but to remind herself the cost of truth isn't glory, it's solitude with purpose, and if the world ever forgot what it asked her to endure, she would still wake, still teach, still write, because the weight of the past, when held with care, becomes the compass for those not yet able to speak. Angelica didn't live for legacy. She lived for continuity, the kind built not on headlines, but on rooms like this, bare, quiet, and fiercely alive. 4 months after the historic hearing, the Houston Police Academy reopened its long-suspended seminar on professional ethics. On the new schedule of instructors, a name appeared, no title, no accolades, just a line in plain font, Washington AA, Seminars on Honor and Community. Classroom B5 sat quietly at the end of the west hallway, a space rarely used, bathed in the sterile glow of cold LED lights, humming above rows of ash-gray molded chairs bolted to the floor. Outside the door, the day's session displayed on the flickering electronic board, "Honor in Law Enforcement, Not a Theory." Angelica arrived at precisely 8 a.m. No announcement, no entourage. She wore a simple black shirt, carried a worn notebook tucked under her arm, and had no name tag pinned to her chest. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't have to. 32 cadets were already seated when she entered, silent not from intimidation, but from the quiet pull of anticipation. This wasn't a standard instructor, but everyone knew who she was, and everyone was waiting for what she might say. "We're not studying law this morning," she began. Her voice was calm, unhurried, like iron tapping iron in the dark. "No procedures, no policies, no charts. You can memorize those. I'm here for what doesn't live in policy but dies without it. Honor." She paused, letting the silence stretch until it pressed inward, until each cadet was leaning not back but forward. A hand went up, hesitant, young, unsure. "Ma'am, what does honor have to do with police work?" Angelica didn't flinch. She nodded once, slowly. "That's the right question, and the reason I'm standing here, because many believe honor comes with a badge, but the truth is, it's something you must forge, quietly, daily, sometimes painfully, not to raise your chin, but to lower it at the right time." She walked the aisles, her eyes meeting theirs. Some stared back, some glanced down, but none looked away. Honor is choosing not to act when someone makes you uncomfortable, just because they look different. It's apologizing without fear of losing face. It's seeing a jogger in a rich neighborhood and not assuming they're trespassing. Then she opened her notebook, not for theory, but for memory. "If one day my child is killed just because of their skin color, let that death be the final kick that cracks the wall of injustice. Don't let it be just another quiet bloodstain in a report." Her voice didn't waver. She didn't have to explain the quote. They all felt the weight. It was from the journal of Darius Monroe. A young man was gunned down for existing. She turned to the board and picked up a black marker. One sentence. No flourish, just the truth. Existence does not need to be legalized, it needs to be respected. She faced the class again. "I'm not here to test your recall of codes. I'm here to ask you to remember this feeling, this confrontation with something irreversible, and to ask yourself, when that moment comes, will you be the one who buries it or the one who chooses not to bow?" No one wrote. No one looked at their watch. The room was so still it hummed. In each face there was no fear but a shifting awareness, a dawning sense that power was not what they thought. It wasn't assertion, it was restraint. There was no bell, no dismissal cue. Angelica closed her notebook, slowly, deliberately. "Time's up," she said. "No farewell, no performance, just presence." She stayed an extra minute, not for drama, just to make sure that what had been said wouldn't pass like a lecture, but land like an inheritance. Some cadets remained seated after she left. One opened his blank notebook, unsure what to write. Another stared at the board. Existence does not need to be legalized. It needs to be respected. He pulled out his phone and took a photo, not to share, but to remember what it felt like to confront that sentence. Angelica didn't go to the lounge. She walked to the training field where a new class was running drills in the sun. She stood quietly at a distance, observing, not critiquing, just witnessing. She didn't say a word. Then she left, just as quietly as she had come, but she knew. Among the dozens of faces sweating through the drills, at least one would remember this morning as the first time they understood that authority begins not with handcuffs, but with the choice not to use them when they aren't needed. That week, Angelica returned for 3 more sessions. She came with only her notebook. No PowerPoint, no bullet points. In one class, she told the story of a patrol officer who changed a report under pressure and lived with that decision every day for 3 years. In another, she described a female officer who stopped an entire vehicle pursuit when she realized the warrant was outdated and was quietly reassigned the next morning. These aren't case studies. No one celebrates them at graduation, but every veteran will call them what they are, right choices. She looked up. Honor isn't something you're given. It's something you choose to keep, with your badge, with your silence, or with your refusal to stay silent. She didn't hand out quizzes, she didn't assign essays, but when she left the room, she always left behind one blank sheet of paper, one question, written by hand. Tomorrow, if someone considered different walks into your patrol zone, what will you do? No instructions, no collection tray, but the next morning, one cadet taped a sheet to the classroom door, handwritten, slightly messy, utterly clear. I won't bow to a wrong order, but I will bow to a human being. Angelica saw it, didn't smile, didn't take a photo. She just stepped into the classroom, as if that answer, quiet, anonymous, and precise, had opened a door that was waiting to be used, a door where a future officer would walk in not just with a weapon or protocol, but with something no academy could put into words, the moral clarity to choose restraint over dominance, to be powerful, not because of what they carry, but because of what they refuse to become. At the end of March, a photograph was quietly hung on the main wall of classroom B5, the seminar room for honor and community at the Houston Police Academy. No ceremony was held, no dedication plaque unveiled. It was simply there one Monday morning, silent, just like the person in the image had once entered the story. The photo, printed in soft grayscale on a medium-sized canvas, hung just to the left of the whiteboard. It was taken from behind, a woman in a dark coat, carrying nothing but a thin folder, stepping through the front entrance of the Houston Police Department. Her shadow stretched down the corridor, cutting across shafts of light from the skylight. Her face was unseen, no badge, no rank, no name was printed, no title listed, no motivational slogan attached. Only a small line of sans-serif text in the lower right corner. She returned. 3 words, short. But in an environment where returning usually belongs only to the powerful or the defeated, those words carried a different weight. She didn't come back for revenge, not to reopen old wounds. She returned because something had been left unfinished, something no one else was quite enough to complete. In the weeks that followed, several cadets asked the room supervisor, "Who is she?" But the supervisor always shook their head. "That's not important. What matters is why she came back." Eventually, the question stopped. The cadet simply looked at the photo at the start of class, and at the end, someone would linger a few seconds, not out of curiosity, but because the image seemed to whisper, "Justice is not a shout. It's a presence, timed, steady, needing no permission." On a breezy Friday afternoon, outside the Houston Police Academy, the steel gates remained closed per facility policy, but the door to B5 was open. Angelica sat in the same chair, not the instructor's seat, but the one beside the window. She no longer needed to stand, not from weariness, but because today's lesson was a continuation of the ones before, where the cadets would do the talking. A young woman stood at the front, her voice still shaky. "I used to think wearing a uniform meant I had the right to give orders. Now I understand. It means I always have to slow down half a second to make sure I'm giving the right one." She didn't look at Angelica when she said it, but Angelica nodded gently, just enough for her to know she'd been heard. The class ended. Cadets filed out one by one. No one said much. No one asked for photos. No one posted on social media. But yesterday's words remained faintly visible on the whiteboard, a message left by one student. "No one is born to be questioned for simply existing." Angelica wiped the board with a handkerchief, slowly, without hurry. She didn't keep the writing, because what needed to last no longer lived on the board. It had moved elsewhere. Deeper. Down the long hallway of the academy, the fading daylight angled through frosted windows, casting light on the photo by the classroom door. That light didn't make the image glow, nor did it obscure it. It simply did its job, illuminating the presence of someone who once came back, at the right time, in the right way, and stayed. Someone once asked her during a closed-door meeting after the hearings, "Aren't you tired? Don't you ever feel drained, carrying things that weren't even your responsibility?" Angelica had replied simply, "I'm tired, but if no one stays, the truth will be shut down even faster." She didn't come back to be a symbol, but in the end, her enduring silence created something no media headline ever could, an image strong enough not to need a name. Team returned. Those words beneath the photo weren't a statement, they were a reminder. Those returns can be quiet, but their echoes stretch far beyond the generations yet to be born. Angelica stepped out of the classroom without locking the door. It was darker now. She didn't look back. She didn't need to, because from now on, the photo would do that for her, not to claim credit, but to hold space for truth, for honor, and for those learning what it means to stay at the right time. The hallway behind her felt still but not empty. The air held something unspoken, like the residue of a story too big to fit into a single chapter. And though no one followed her steps that evening, a dozen notebooks would carry her silence into future mornings. Somewhere down the line, another cadet would sit in that room, glance at that photograph, and not ask who, but instead whisper, "How?" And that alone would mean the work wasn't lost, just passed on. Because legacy, when built right, never needs applause, only continuity, and someone quiet enough to carry it forward. The story of Angelica Washington is not just the journey of a black female military police officer who was discriminated against, falsely accused, and pushed out of the very system she once served with honor. It is a mirror reflecting countless others who have been misjudged simply because they didn't fit a certain mold, because of their skin color, gender, background, or the way they chose to speak. At every stage, Angelica had the option to step back. She could have stayed silent when she was slapped in a gated community just for being black in the wrong place. She could have ignored the accusations, questioning her mental stability. She could have signed a neutrality agreement to keep her rank and career. But she didn't take the easy road, because Angelica understood honor is not something bestowed by rank or medals. It is how you stand firm when the truth is pushed to the margins. This story is a powerful reminder. Never be too quick to judge others based on prejudice. What you see on the surface, skin tone, circumstances, and expression, does not reflect a person's true worth. Angelica, once labeled a suspicious outsider just for jogging in the morning, was in fact a seasoned commander who had led life-and-death missions in the Middle East and saved her comrades through decisive action. But that didn't stop some people from dismissing her, simply because they looked with their eyes, not with understanding. One of the most important lessons this story conveys is this: the talent and worth of a person should never be diminished simply because they don't look the way you expect. In today's world, where people are reduced to profiles, labels, and social status, it's easy for someone to be miscast, misunderstood, or sidelined from opportunity simply because they don't match the image. But the truth is, it's those who dare to challenge bias, like Angelica, who are keeping society from collapsing under the weight of artificial consensus. In the end, this story also carries an enduring belief. Justice always finds a way to win. It may not come quickly. It may not arrive with noise. But justice, when guarded by those who refuse to compromise, will eventually emerge and shift the balance. Angelica didn't demand that anyone defend her. She didn't wait for someone to restore her honor. She gathered the evidence herself, faced the system head-on, and walked through rooms of power where silence was expected. And in the end, the truth she steadfastly pursued began to dismantle a structure once thought immovable. Have you ever been misjudged simply because someone didn't truly understand you? Have you ever been underestimated, only to quietly prove you were more capable than they believed? Perhaps you're not a soldier and you've never worn a uniform, but maybe, like Angelica, you've felt misplaced, pushed aside, just because you didn't match what the majority expected. If you see a part of yourself in this story, share it, not just so more people can know Angelica Washington, but so others out there, those standing strong in silence, can feel less alone. Share it so they know there are stories that have been lived, endured, and justice is not a naive dream, but a real thing if we remain determined enough to call it by its name. And if this story made you reflect, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire. Stories that don't promise fairy tales, but tell the truth, not to satisfy you for a moment, but to leave behind an echo that makes you reflect and choose rightly, even when no one is cheering. Angelica stepped out of the ranks to preserve something greater than the ranks, truth. And you, where will you choose to stand when the truth needs someone who won't stay silent? Thank you for taking the time to follow my channel. Your support and interest are powerful motivations that drive me to continue producing meaningful, high-quality content. In the days ahead, I'll bring you even more compelling stories and sharper perspectives, not just to entertain, but to speak to truths that deserve to be heard. Please keep watching, sharing, and spreading the message, because this journey always has room for those who believe in truth and human worth. Thank you so much.